Welcome to This Explainer. Have you ever wondered why some people leave a massive, indelible mark on history, for better or worse, while others dedicate their entire existence to mastering the absolute smallest, most mundane details of life? Well, today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating philosophical essay by Xu titled Patterns and Realms Originate from Ideals. This piece challenges us to look at human ambition through a completely different lens. The author presents this really compelling structural argument: the physical scale of a person's life, the height of their achievements, and their ultimate impact on the world are directly dictated by the scale of their internal ideals. Essentially, we're going to explore how the actual size of your thoughts draws the literal blueprint for the size of your life.
Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, the power of ideals.
To understand human behavior, we really have to look at the engine driving it. Xu states right at the beginning, quote, "The grandeur of one's ideals determines the breadth of one's patterns and the depth of one's realms." Now, for this analysis, the author asks us to do something a bit challenging but absolutely crucial. We need to temporarily put aside our usual moral judgments. We have to step back from evaluating personal qualities or weighing the massive societal harm certain historical figures have caused. Instead, we are asked to purely observe the raw mechanics of ambition. We're looking at how a stated goal mechanically builds a person's reality. It's a fascinating exercise in observing human trajectory purely through the physics of intention. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. The author asks us to look at two absolute extremes of human ambition, contrasting macro-scale ideals with micro-scale ones. On one side, you have historical figures who held massive, world-altering ideals. Donald Trump's ideal was to make America great again. Former Japanese Prime Minister Konoe Fumimaro's ideal was to establish the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. Hitler's ideal was to stand at the highest point in the world and demand global attention. Again, remaining strictly neutral and putting aside the devastating harm caused by some of these figures, the author's point is purely mechanical. Their macro-scale ideals literally made them world leaders. They didn't achieve extreme historical prominence because their goal was just to get a comfortable job. Their goal was to shape nations. Now contrast that with the author's example of the highly focused thief. This thief spends all of their time intensely studying fashion and tailoring, not to make clothes, mind you, but purely to locate exactly where the pockets are so they can steal wallets more efficiently. Because their ideal is so microscopic and hyper-focused on this one tiny transaction, the absolute highest peak they can ever possibly reach is becoming an invincible thief. The scale of their goal traps them at that microscopic level. They can never be anything more simply because they didn't aim for anything more. Which brings us to Section 2, the tragedy of selfishness. We just looked at world-shaping scale. Now, let's shift our perspective to examine the real-world consequences of small, selfish ideals. The author uses concrete data from China as a primary example to show exactly what happens when a society's ideals shrink down to just the self. First, since the 18th National Congress, nearly 5 million corrupt officials have been punished. 5 million. Let that staggering number sink in for a second. The author argues this massive figure is driven by individuals who held one very small, highly selfish ideal: to accumulate as much money as possible without any grander vision for their community or their country. Building right on that, between 1988 and 2021, 33.48 million criminals were arrested. Chalfant links this massive societal tragedy directly to individual selfishness and ego. Think about how a lack of a higher ideal directly manufactures conflict. When all you care about is yourself, your wealth, and your immediate desires, you inevitably collide with millions of other people who only care about themselves. When the ideal cannot rise above pure self-interest, the pattern of life simply devolves into a desperate struggle for resources, leading straight to conflict and criminality. Next, we see the truly overwhelming figure of 780 million people in debt, averaging about 140,000 yuan per person. To put that into perspective, it's a massive financial strain. The author roots this widespread struggle in the hollow, superficial ideal of satisfying personal vanity. We all feel that modern pressure to look successful to others, right? But Xu points out that when looking good to others becomes your ultimate ideal, it essentially traps you in a financial cage. It transforms everyday life into this constant, grinding burden. Finally, concluding this rapid-fire data sequence is the somber reality that nearly 300,000 people commit suicide each year. Xu ties this ultimate tragedy not just to a mental health crisis, but to a fundamental crisis of purpose. When life is devoid of correct faith and lacks a higher horizon to aim for, the daily friction of existence becomes almost unbearable. Without a grand ideal to pull us forward, the weight of the present can simply become too much. So what does this all mean? When we summarize all this heavy data, we arrive at the author's central inductive conclusion. There is a direct observable correlation at play here. The lower and closer the ideal, meaning the more selfish and short-sighted it is, the harder and more bitter the life becomes. Conversely, the higher and farther the ideal, the more glorious and fulfilling the life. Small thinking doesn't just limit your potential. According to the author's framework, small thinking literally manufactures human suffering. Let's move to section 3 and see how this builds. A spectrum of ambition. The author gives us a really fascinating 8-person thought experiment to test this theory out. It's like a giant puzzle mapping human behavior. I want to walk you through a few of these personas because it perfectly maps out how specific ideals dictate specific achievements and risks. Look at person 1. Their ideal is just to have a house and 3 kids. It's simple, it's localized. Then you have person 3, who wants to glorify their ancestors and make everyone envious of their success. Person 6, they want to be president. And then way over on the end, person 8's ideal is to let everyone in the world live a happy, free, and blessed life. Based on Shufeng's framework, the predicted outcomes for these people vary wildly. Because person 3 is driven primarily by envy and superiority, their risk of turning to crime to maintain that image is predicted to be quite high. Person 6 has a massive ideal, for sure. But depending on the underlying intent of wielding that presidential power, they run a high risk of becoming a dictator. But look at the drastic leap when we get to person 8. Because their ideal is so high, so far-reaching, and entirely focused on universal well-being, the probability of them becoming corrupt or committing crimes drops to almost 0. They're driven by a kind of saintly incorruptibility that insulates them from petty temptations. That takes us right into section 4, the modern ideal crisis. This brings us to a really critical transition in the essay, the author's critique of our current global climate. We're living, as Shufeng describes it, in an era completely dominated by money, capital, and power operation. Society has largely abandoned grand ideals. Think about it. When was the last time you heard someone genuinely talk about their grand ideal for humanity without someone else in the room rolling their eyes? Ideals today are generally dismissed as a void thing, something empty, unrealistic, or just hopelessly naive. Because we've stopped striving for these profound purposes, trading them in for transactional survival, the author argues, we are now struggling to see any beautiful prospect for human civilization. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Shufeng connects our modern geopolitical and social crises directly back to this exact lack of purpose. Without grand, unifying ideals, we are basically left with nothing but friction. This manifests as the intense confrontation of consciousness between the East and the West. It creates endless, grinding national interest conflicts. It causes the desperate survival confrontation between humanity and nature, and even on a micro level, constant interpersonal cognitive confrontation. We literally fight each other in our homes, our communities, and across borders simply because we lack a higher, shared horizon to look toward together. This leads to a really crucial warning in section 5, the dictator's false utopia. Here, the author makes a brilliant pivot to offer a deep philosophical warning. Just because an ideal sounds grand doesn't mean it's genuine. There is immense danger in grand-sounding ideals that actually lack any real substance. Shufeng defines a concept often seen thrown around on the internet, called the Great Harmony World. The author cautions that when an ideal like this is used merely as a slogan, an empty buzzword without any specific, beneficial content for humanity, it becomes incredibly dangerous. An empty slogan is the absolute perfect camouflage for authoritarianism. A grand ideal used as a mask can easily be weaponized to control rather than to liberate. So, the crucial point is recognizing the terrifying criteria of a dictator's false utopia. If someone claims to be building a great harmony world, but they accomplish it by systematically stripping away personal freedom, erasing freedom of speech, and outlawing freedom of thought, well, that is not an ideal. The contrast here is stark. A utopia that requires you to be kept in a cage is just a massive prison. The author warns us to be highly critical of grand ideals that demand the surrender of fundamental human liberties under the false guise of harmony. But, despite this heavy warning, the essay does not end in despair. In fact, it concludes on a really optimistic note. After diagnosing the root of human tragedy as small, selfish thinking, and warning us of the trap of false utopias, the author's ultimate hope is for the future of humanity. Shufeng hopes for the birth of more and more people who possess genuine saintly thoughts and truly grand ideals, people who aim to elevate humanity without chaining it.
Which leaves us with the most important part of this entire explainer. Look at your own life, the scale of your ambitions, and the depth of your daily pursuits. Are you spending your days intensely studying the pockets? Or are you trying to elevate the world? I want you to really deeply think about this. What is your ideal?